Hello, everybody, and welcome to Brunch with Bigfoot, Michigan Rob. I, of course, am your host, BMR. And joining me in Studio B from Texas, working on 0 hours sleep in the last 24 hours, surprisingly, my co-host Tex will be joining. Thanks to Tex, he can't fall asleep, you guys. So everybody with Tex, a round of applause for coming on. I know why he's coming on, though. We have a fantastic guest, Dr. Dean Bertram. We got a lot to unpack today. It's going to be one of those great shows, a topic that I'm intrigued with. I think Dean was on 3-4 months ago, talked about the shaver mystery. We're going to talk about some UFO and alien stuff and maybe the origins of the Men in Black. So it's going to be a pretty cool show. No cryptids today, but you know what? We've all evolved, right? And that's what it's all about. Evolve and get better with what you do. If this is your first time here, please subscribe to Bigfoot Michigan Rob on YouTube, Texas Front Porch on YouTube, and the Blondes and the Booze Paranormal Podcast on YouTube. You can find us on iHeartRadio, Spreaker, wherever podcasts are found. If you like and want to help support what we do around here, the Super Chat is open. It's a great way to help support the channel. Thank you so much for that. Also, you can become a BMR pirate. Join the many. Join the pirates that are out there. It's kind of cool. It's fun. You get a picture of me with a bandana next to your name in the chat room. So thanks for everybody for that and for coming on in. A lot of things going on. Mondays is Texas Front Porch. Texas on 8 o'clock to 11 on Mondays. 8 o'clock kicks it off with the Diva Dimension. Fantastic shows. Check those out on Monday. Tuesday, Beyond BMR, 9 o'clock in the East with Krista. Thursdays, right back here with myself and Tex. Brunch with Bigfoot, Michigan Rob, 1 o'clock in the East. Followed up tonight, 9 o'clock in the East. And Tex will be there again. Boy, Tex, I got to tell you, buddy. He'll be on at 9 in the East. The Blondes and the Booze. Tonight, after that at 11, Monica Rollins, Our Paranormal World, will be popping in. So go check her out and subscribe if not already. Fridays, the Blondes are back on at 8 in the East. Saturday, the new show. Well, it's not really new. It's been out about 3 months. Late night with BMR, and there's Krista, Brandy, and Monica. Tex is sleeping, so he's kind of doesn't do that show. But hey, Tex has got a lot going on. In fact, Tex has some other new things coming up too for us in the next couple of weeks, which I'm not going to talk about right now. Maybe Tex will in a minute. Saturdays, of course, my show at midnight. Sundays, Truth or Tinfoil, 6 in the East. Followed up by Infamous Minds, True Crime with Miss Diva, 7 o'clock in the East. So thanks to everybody for coming on in. Do appreciate it. You guys are awesome. And let's see here. I just seen something here. Denise, thank you so much. What a way to start the show. The nice super sticker from Denise. Thank you so much, Denise. Thanks to everybody for coming in. So I'm going to bring up Tex. There he is. There he is.
Howdy.
Tex, I don't know how you're doing it, man.
I don't know.
I don't know.
It's I don't know. You know, I've had 2 hours sleep. So
right.
But I'm want to try to do this show, go back to sleep, get up, do the Blondes, then go to work, come back. So we'll get it handled. We'll get it handled.
Yeah, you'll get it handled. I mean, sometimes life throws us a monkey wrench.
It do,
right?
It do.
And we got to deal with it. I am kind of glad that you're on because I was telling Dean backstage that I'm watching my buddy's dog. It's 3 months old, and I know he's going to take a potty break within the hour or so. And I didn't want to leave him hanging. Although Dr. Dean, he's well versed. He can speak. He's got his own show, Talking Weird, on Untold Radio. So he's very familiar with the podcast world.
Oh yeah.
So I'm pleased to have him on, and I'm going to bring him up right now.
Well, howdy, Rob. Howdy, Tex. It's good to be back with you guys.
I'm sure you get called Doc, Dean, Bertram, Bert. I bet you've heard everything.
I've never heard Bert, I don't think. Bert's a new one, but that's kind of fun.
Well, I may have to stick with Bert because I was going to start calling you Dino.
So, sorry, what was that? What were you going to call me?
I was going to start calling you Dino.
Dino. I've had Dino, but yeah, you can just call me. You can call me Bert, Dean, whatever you want to. My friends in Sydney used to call me Doc as a joke. I think after I got my PhD, so. But I'm easy.
Yeah, you probably got the joke. You're not a real doctor. Big deal. You got a PhD, right?
I always thought it'd be funny. I'd be on a plane, and the air stewardess would say, "We had somebody, we've got problems in first class. Is somebody here can help?" And I'd write, "Is there any doctor in the house?" I'd run. "I'm a doctor." They'd be like, "This man's having a coronary attack or something." I'd be like, "Well, I can talk to you about the American Civil War at length if you want me to, but I can't help with the coronary."
That'd be like a psychiatrist. Hey, is there a doctor on board? Yeah. Well, you're having a heart attack. Well, help me, doc. Well, how does this make you feel?
Exactly.
I was just looking at your name. Now the text brings up these things. Bertram. So I can see Bert, but now I think another cool one is just call you the Tram. The Tram.
The Tram. Or the Ram. I'm an Aries.
The
Ram.
There you go. There you
There's a
go.
lot of, hey, you're
Ram. Dr. Ram.
Hey,
That's like a porn name, Dr. Ram.
It's like we can make a lot of plays on words with your name. I just realized. Yeah, porn names. They say the porn stars, they take their dog's name and their the street they live on. I read that somewhere long time ago.
Yeah.
So if if I was to be a porn star, my name would have been Coco Culver.
When I heard that back in the day, mine would have been Apollo Sutherland. It sounds pretty cool.
Yeah. 'Cause my dog was Coco. I live on street Culver. Coco Culver.
Yeah, that's a cool name.
That is kind of, for the porn industry, I guess, but anyways, enough of that. It's
growing up, might have been growing up when I was a teenager. If I'd have took that one.
Oh, what? Oh God. Yeah, we will. It's NC-17 this afternoon, so
I've had so. Now I had a. See, with me, it'd probably, I don't know, it could have been a dog or a horse, because I had both. It would have been the dog at that time and where I was living.
Yeah.
It would have been Apache Dry Creek.
Apache Dry Creek.
Dry Creek.
Oh, Apache Dry. Oh yeah. There's so many things we can say about that one. Anyways, we'll get on with it.
How much of a porn name?
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of out there. What a way to start the show.
Well, Dean jumped on here with us, and he's thinking, well, I know these guys are a little bit laid back, and we just have a conversation. We do have a good time. But I bet he never in his wildest dreams thought we'd be talking about porn names when we got up on the damn show.
Hell, I didn't either, man. I had no idea. That's the furthest from my mind. But great minds think alike, I guess.
Well, there is some exciting news that nobody's really talked about. But since we got Dean on, I think we can probably mention it. Well, I heard a rumor about Dean, and this rumor is supposed to come to fruition next year in October, September sometime. Does that ring any bells?
To me or to Rob?
Not to me.
Either one of you, evidently not.
I think Jason McLean mentioned something to me. That's what I think you might be speaking of.
Yeah.
No, I'm looking very forward to that. I don't know if we're meant to say anything yet or not. I'm not sure.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Okay. Yeah, no, that'd be fantastic.
See, we can drop little Easter eggs, and everybody can, I mean, the rumors will fly, and it's,
yeah.
That's the
Kimber
way.
says we must brace ourselves. Yes, Kimber. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that if that does come to fruition, by the way. So that'd be cool.
I'm all in for that. That sounds great.
You know, Dean, here lately, we've been talking a lot about the whole UFO thing. And the black-eyed kid thing came up. And then, of course, when you talk black-eyed kids, for some reason, Men in Black comes up. Why?
I guess they're not culturally that dissimilar, the idea that something comes to your door to disturb you. I mean, a lot of this stuff traces back. In fact, there was somebody who wrote a PhD before I did. I wrote mine on American UFO belief, but they wrote a PhD dissertation. I wish I could remember their name, on Men in Black and on the cultural precursors to the Men in Black. And a lot of Men in Black appearances seem very much like traditional cultural appearances of devil, or the devil knocking at your door, a man in a black suit who comes to, make a deal with you or threaten you. And I suppose black-eyed children fit into that myth as well, something that knocks on your door and has come to terrorize you. So there isn't that big a difference in the kind of the role perhaps some of these things fill culturally. Whatever the reality of the phenomenon or not, you can certainly see those cultural similarities.
Yeah, I mean, some people say they're the same thing. I don't know. I don't know where they tie that in yet. I mean, I guess it's like you said, it's the whole devil at your door type thing. And
there's different Men in Black experience as well. There's ones which seem very much like it's almost like it might be somebody, a special agent of the US government who's come to, to make you be quiet about you've seen something that you shouldn't. And then there's the weirder experiences, which are well known in the writings of John Keel, and they appear also in Gray Barker's seminal They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. They appear in Albert Bender's experiences when he talked about his UFO kind of early flying saucer club being shut down, where these things that they seem to be more paranormal. They don't seem to be government agents. They look weird. They behave strangely. Their features aren't quite right. So I do think that is much closer to the black-eyed children. Something that's kind of vaguely looks human, but probably isn't, is somehow something darker or supernatural.
This is kind of a great segue, because a lot of the topics today's where we're going to talk about revolves around like the Men in Black, the origins, because we were talking the other night and you were telling me about something I had never heard of, about the Maury Island incident, which I guess allegedly, Dean, I'll let you tell the story, of course. There's a UFO crash supposedly 2 weeks prior to Roswell. So it's typically, if you go back historically, that's really the first one that we know of, but you don't hear much about that. And of course, it kind of evolved into, we found out about the Men in Black. So I'll let you get on with that. I think it's a fascinating way to start the show and a great topic.
Sure. I'll begin by saying there is certainly many opinions that say the Maury Island incident might have been a hoax or might have been a cover-up of something else. But I will tell you guys and the audience the traditional Maury Island incident story as if it actually happened. And that is on June 21. So this is 3 days before June 24, 1947, when Kenneth Arnold first has his famous sighting near Mount Rainier, when he sees the 9 strange objects which enter, I suppose, our vernacular as flying saucers, and then the modern UFO era explodes. But this is 3 days before Kenneth Arnold had his sighting, and at a location where you could actually see Mount Rainier from. You can see Mount Rainier very clearly from Maury Island. So Maury Island sits off the west coast of the United States. It's part of Washington state. And between the mainland and Maury Island, there's a body of water called Puget Sound. And on that day, a man who supposedly was a salvage operator, he would go out into the harbor and he would recover logs that were floating around from various lumber yards, and then he would sell them back to the lumber companies. His name was Harold Dahl, and on board his boat, he had with him his son, their dog, and 2 other crew members' names who have been lost to history. Anyway, while they were engaged in their salvage operation, as they would do in Puget Sound, again between Maury Island and between the mainland, where just across from it is Des Moines or Tacoma or Seattle, that type of area of Washington state, they notice in the sky this flying saucer. In fact, it's a flying donut because in the middle of it, it's kind of hollow. It looks like a metallic donut, quite large, the typical type of saucer size, I guess, hovering in the air. And it's surrounded by 5 other saucers, or 5 other donuts, flying donuts. And this thing is kind of wobbling in the air and it looks like it's in trouble. Then it starts spewing out of it metallic slag. Some pieces are said to be like kind of almost like hot coal. Some are like paper thin aluminum type stuff, apparently. And this stuff starts falling into Puget Sound. And the water is steaming, and Harold Dahl and his crew decide, let's get out of here because it's falling near them. So they motor very quickly to the shore, and they beach their boat on the shore of Maury Island. And this saucer, or this donut, which looks like it's in trouble, starts spewing out this metallic slag onto the top of their boat. It damages the boat. It injures Harold Dahl's son, injures his arm, and it kills their dog. And they kind of run from the boat and they hide within kind of driftwood logs on the shore. And then eventually they watch these other 5 saucers continue to surround the one which is in trouble, and then they all fly off. Anyway, they go back to the mainland, back to somewhere in Tacoma, I believe, or Des Moines, that part of Seattle anyway. And one of the most interesting characters of the story now comes into the story. His name's Fred Chrisman. We've talked about the shaver mystery before, and Fred Chrisman had written a letter to Ray Palmer at Amazing Stories about the shaver mystery, saying that he himself had encountered the Darrow, these strange underground alien type beings that supposedly abducted people, and he'd been in a gunfight in them during World War II. And when he was a pilot, supposedly he downed on an island in Burma, and the Darrow had actually shot him and I think burnt a hole in his arm with a laser or something. So he was already known to Raymond Palmer. And anyway, when Harold Dahl goes back with a damaged boat, different stories have different versions of the relationship of Fred Chrisman and Harold Dahl, but the most popular version is that Fred Chrisman is somehow Harold Dahl's boss in this bigger salvage operation. And Harold Dahl tells Fred Chrisman what happened. Fred Chrisman goes to Maury Island and gathers up some of this slag material. And he himself sees a flying saucer, a flying donut hovering around, acting like it's looking for something. And then Fred Chrisman and Harold Dahl send these materials, some of these materials anyway, that they recover from supposedly the in trouble saucer or the in trouble donut, to Ray Palmer at Amazing Stories, telling him what they've seen. In the meantime, the day after the actual incident, so the incident happened on June 21. Again, this is 3 days before Kenneth Arnold has his famous sighting. But the following day on June 22, Harold Dahl allegedly receives a visit from a mysterious man in a black hat, in a black suit, very traditionally what we now imagine as the Men in Black type of look. He visits Harold Dahl's home and he says, I want to have a conversation with you. I know what you saw yesterday. Let's go to a cafe where your family aren't around and let's talk. So they go to this cafe, and essentially the man the man in black, even though we didn't have that terminology yet, gives Harold Dahl the traditional kind of warning. He tells him everything that Harold Dahl saw without Harold Dahl telling him anything. I know the sources came, they dropped stuff on the boat and all the things that happened, as if he was there himself. And he said, it would be better for you if you didn't tell anybody. So he gave him that standard Men in Black warning, which we're used to hearing in so much of the narratives. Again, this is the very first time this has ever been reported. This is before we have the phrase Men in Black, which is later popularized by authors like Gray Barker and John Keel. But it becomes part of the story as Ray Palmer tells it. Because if we flash forward now, Palmer gets the debris. His curiosity is piqued. Again, he's the person who co-created the Shaver mystery, ran the story from sci-fi writer Richard Shaver, who said he was having experiences with technologically advanced alien-type beings who lived beneath the center of this earth. And what does Ray Palmer do? By now, Kenneth Arnold's sighting has been reported on June 24. Flying saucers are a thing now in the United States of America. Ray Palmer reaches out to Kenneth Arnold, who he doesn't know at this stage, and says, I want you to write for me at Amazing Stories. I want to send you in advance. I want you to go to Maury Island and investigate this claim that I've just been told about. And so, long story short, Kenneth Arnold does go to Maury Island to investigate, and then the story blows up even further from there, which we can talk about. But that's kind of the beginning of the overview before Arnold gets involved, and the story gets even weirder.
Really what's weird about this, everybody's heard about the Men in Black, and some people differ on opinions. Part of a governmental agency. Some people even go a little out there with maybe they're not even human beings from our government. They're from another world, right? But what I found, and I'm not suggesting either one, but what I'm saying is this: don't you find that really peculiar? How this alleged prior to becoming the Men in Black, how they knew the entire event, like they were there. I mean, they weren't there, but they saw it, or somebody had to report this information to them. Correct?
Well, that's the way it's presented, and interestingly, well, this is our first example of a modern Men in Black case. Like I said, there have been folklorists and historians who have made comparisons to lore about the devil and lore about other strange black dress creatures coming and knocking on people's doors and bothering them. But certainly this is the very first example, as I mentioned before. And this is also where that kind of almost psychic ability, or this omnipresent or omniscient ability of the Men in Black to be able to tell witnesses what they saw seems to come from. Because while it isn't the first time that's been the version of what's happened, it's certainly, well, that probably was the first time, it certainly wasn't the last. Again and again, we have these characters who appear supposedly on the doors of UFO witnesses, knowing what they'd seen and what they'd experienced. So it's a very strange phenomenon.
Somebody, and it's a good question. Danita Whitson was asking, can we look up that original story anywhere?
Sure. They're probably the first places it was. I mean, you can see it anywhere. You can get it in, various UFO encyclopedias, or there's a book by the late Ken Thomas on, I think it's called The Chrisman Conspiracy. And it talks about all the things Fred Chrisman was involved with, including the Maury Island incident. But where it was originally published was by Ray Palmer in the very first issue of Fate magazine, which is still around today. Ray Palmer launched that after his run at Amazing Stories. Actually, he was still the editor of Amazing Stories, and he launched Fate magazine on the side under a pseudonym. So the publishers of Amazing Stories, Ziff Davis, wouldn't know he was moonlighting with his own magazine. But in the very first issue of Fate, a lot of your viewers and listeners are probably familiar with it. It has kind of a small which is meant to be Kenneth Arnold's single, engine plane in the sky, and it's above, I think. I don't know if you can see Mount Rainier below it, but it's has a number of flying kind of saucers floating around it. That's the famous cover art of the first Fate magazine. I believe Palmer and Arnold first talk about that incident in there, and then they wrote a book a couple of years later, which was that. So that was 1948. I think Coming of the Saucers comes out in 1950 or 51. It's very early anyway in the history of flying saucer publications. And the Coming of the Saucers, which you can get in a few different editions of. The very original edition, the hardcover greenback, which is beautiful, which I have a copy of, is very expensive. But Chanel Shands, who's the granddaughter of Kenneth Arnold, has republished the book recently with additional photos in it. So you can buy The Coming of the Saucers on eBay. There's also a kind of a bootleg copy, but get Chanel's copy if you're going to get one. It will say something like the official copy or the official version. And it has a photo of Ken Arnold, the pilot, standing near his plane, holding a camera and looking up at the sky, I believe. But that has a lot of awesome photos in it. But that tells the story. So if your reader wants to read it in Kenneth Arnold's own words, and probably fairly heavily ghost written by Ray Palmer, in fairness, if they want to hear the original iteration of the story, The Coming of the Saucers is the book to go to.
I had a quick question too. Were there any reports about any other people that maybe a few miles away from the island where this encounter took place, where they seen this donut-shaped craft in the sky?
That's a very good question. I'm unaware of any other reports surrounding the Maury Island incident where other people witnessed this. And some people say today, and this is a point that Steve Edmiston, who's the man who runs the Men in Black Birthday Bash Festival that I was at recently it was the 77th anniversary of the Maury Island incident when I was there. But he makes the point of saying, a lot of people say, well, other people should have seen this because it's in Puget Sound and we can see it from the mainland between here and Maury. But back then, Des Moines, which is directly opposite, where you could have seen it. I think it had a population of, maybe, I think it was a very small population, maybe 1,000 or something people. So you would have had to have been looking at a very precise time to probably have seen this incident, because according to Dahl, it happened fairly briefly. There are other reports near it in the area of flying discs, including, of course, Kenneth Arnold's famous report on June 24. And one of the interesting things when you're at Maury Island is you can look and you can see Mount Rainier very clearly, like it's right there across the coast, and just back a little bit, it kind of almost hovers over the scene. And also, when Kenneth Arnold flew to Maury Island to investigate a month after the actual Maury Island incident happened, so by the time Palmer gets a hold of him and he flies out there, I think it's the end of July. But he had his second sighting. So Arnold had his original famous sighting that everybody knows about on June 24. But in late July, flying to Maury Island to do the investigation for Ray Palmer, he has another sighting of multiple strange objects in the sky. So certainly in that part of the world, it seems to be that there were experiences with strange things in the sky in that period of American history. And of course, it's also known as the Summer of the Saucers. June to July and into August of 1947 has that title now, Summer of the Saucers, because there was a major wave in America, which Kenneth Arnold's sighting kicked off, at least on a publicity level. But there were reports before and reports after, including, of course, the Maury Island incident, that while it wasn't reported, or at least didn't get any press until after Arnold's sighting, it certainly allegedly had taken place 3 days before Arnold had that sighting.
Do you see any ties to these? And I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this question where it makes sense. Any ties to like a time frame, like a war, like World War II or anything, where the this stuff amps up? And because I kind of heard that before.
Well, the popular theory, and it's not necessarily it's a theory I agree with, but in a slightly different way. The popular theory, which has been very prevalent in the flying saucer community or in ufology from the early days, is that somehow after we started doing nuclear testing, and certainly after we dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, atomic bombs, that somehow this alerted the aliens to our presence or made them more concerned about us. So they started coming here and checking up on us and coming with the type of warnings that we see in The Day the Earth Stood Still, the science fiction movie about, we don't want you to, extend this, atomic race into outer space. That said, I'm not sure if I believe that interpretation. I do, however, believe that World War II and the consciousness that the whole world then had of the devastation and the danger of things in the sky that it posed to civilian communities, again after Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Pearl Harbor and Dresden firebombing and just the Battle of Britain, all these ideas that things happening in the sky could be very dangerous to you. I think there was an increased awareness of the danger of things in the sky. And I talked about this a little bit in both my master's dissertation and my PhD dissertation. And then the whole birth of the atomic age, on top of that, made people super conscious that we were entering some new strange time. We're entering a Cold War with the Soviets. Again, pay more attention to the things seen in the skies. And what that means to the reality of the UFO phenomenon, I'm not sure phenomenologically what it means. I do think that it changed our perception of how we thought about these things. We were also, of course, on the cusp of the space age, because Werner von Braun, the Nazi rocket scientist, had been picked up by NASA by this stage as well, or picked up then by the US. I don't know if NASA existed yet, but had been picked up by the US and was starting already to move to this type of, getting us to the moon, really. Now, there was certainly movements in popular culture as well, including in Amazing Stories, Ray Palmer's magazine, but just generally this idea that we were going to be going to space soon. Science fiction was a thing. Culturally, this was an idea now. So all of these things kind of coalesced, I think. Whatever the reality, again, of the flying saucer phenomenon, that's a difficult discussion, and there's all kinds of opinions. But your question is so important, Tex, because the flying saucer phenomenon does begin, the modern flying saucer phenomenon begins at a very specific time in history. Don't forget, too, so much of the legend or the lore that surrounds flying saucers and UFOs has to do with US government secrecy. That's been a constant from that book, Coming of the Saucers, or from the early Fate issues, all the way through to the type of congressional hearings and whistleblowers like Grush now. The idea that the US government knows something and they're not telling us something. Now, that didn't make sense before World War II. We didn't have the national security state until after World War II. 1947, the same year that the flying saucers really become a thing in America, is the same year that the National Security Act signed. It's the same year that we launched the national security state apparatus. It's the same time that, in a way, American democracy on some levels closes. Like, there are spaces now you can't go to, you can't see. And that wasn't really a thing 20 years before or even 10 years before World War II. It becomes a thing. Government becomes compartmentalized, and there's things we don't know about. The Trinity Project's a classic example of that in World War II. This high secret, government program. I don't know. Did I drop out for a minute?
Yeah, you did.
Yep.
You're fine. I mean,
okay. I was just saying this was the period where the Trinity Project in World War II was about as well. So you get this idea that all of a sudden the government is creating this incredibly advanced, dangerous technology, and the public are kept totally in the dark about what's happening, for better or for worse. Maybe that's all understandable, but it's a very specific time and period. It's a very specific period in history that the flying saucers become what they are. You know what I mean? People had seen weird things in the skies forever. If you go back even into the early 20th century and into the late 19th century, American newspapers are filled with people reporting weird things in the skies, but they're never seen within the context that they were after World War II, where it becomes this incredibly strange mystery. The government know how somehow it's likely something from outer space. It all came together. So again, whatever the phenomenon is, the belief system, you can really trace it to that moment in history.
Dude, we got a lot of questions. I'm marking text, and I'm marking some questions. So everybody, we'll get to your questions a little bit later. So interesting that Tex brought this up, and now we're talking about the atomic age. We're talking about, the Cold War, and do you buy into we're talking about the Men in Black and aliens, otherworldlies. We've all heard the stories about how a potential nuclear disaster had been averted by the otherworldly people, aliens, if you will. You buy into that theory? You think that's happened throughout time?
I'm not sure if I buy into that theory exactly. I think there's certainly stories which seem to be legitimate about flying saucers penetrating sensitive US airspace, including supposedly where nuclear silos are. I was rereading again. I hadn't, just because I wanted a fun book to read at the beach. So I recently, it's hard to get cheap UFO books now. And I lost most of my UFO library when I moved from Australia to Sydney, although I've rebuilt it extensively. But long story short, I recently got 50 old UFO paperbacks. I prefer hardback, but 50 UFO paperbacks from, like, I don't know, the 60s through the early 90s for $50 on eBay, which is unthinkable these days because flying saucer books are so expensive. Anyway, I pulled one out to go to the beach the other day, and I'd read it years ago. It was Bloom's Out There, which is a fairly significant book. Whitley Strieber sung the praises about it back in the day. And the book starts with a case of US airspace, I guess, being penetrated by something, or our kind of outer, or it actually wasn't even airspace. It was kind of the system we had to let us know if any nuclear rockets were coming in back in the day, or any atomic rockets were coming. We were monitoring space very clearly, and there being something that couldn't be explained in that space, essentially an unidentified flying object, and how seriously that was taken, and the events which that triggered within US security. How much of that book is 100% true, I'm not sure, although it's certainly believable. And I do think that those type of incursions probably made people within the national security and the military, I guess, defense structure take UFOs very seriously. And I think there's a long history of that. Like, there's something early on, very early on, I think it's the late 40s, called the Robertson Panel, where the CIA essentially did a study, and they wanted to know what was the reality of the sources, or what kind of impact could they have on US society, on our ability to defend ourselves from the Soviets. And one of the conclusions was that it could be dangerous in the capacity that these things could be misidentified either way. Like people could see a UFO and think it was the Soviets, or they could mistake the Soviets for UFOs. And so it was probably better to downplay the flying saucer thing to the American public. And I can understand that. Like if, again, this is how intricately so it's not really answering your question, just in a very weird roundabout way. But again, it illustrates how whatever the reality of UFOs coming and stopping a nuclear event, how the potential of these things was connected to the way that we viewed global politics during the Cold War, because you couldn't have things buzzing around in airspace that you didn't know what it was. I mean, it was unthinkable. You can't have something penetrating where there is a missile silo and not knowing what it is during the Cold War. So there's no doubt. And you can't have people running around talking about weird invasions of strange craft during the Cold War anyway. So I'm sure in many ways the flying saucers were both, at least the way people were viewing them, were a result of the Cold War and a result of World War II and a result of the space race. But I'm sure the way the military and the defense complex here was responding to them had an awful lot to do with the Cold War as well. So you can't really even talk about flying saucers without talking about the period that they appeared in. And regardless of what the reality of what some people have suggested, which was your point, Rob, you can't look at them without thinking about those things, thinking about this is obviously something which was preoccupying people.
One of your countrymen, your fellow countrymen, says, I'm loving this show. Just became a member for 4 months. Thank you, Lolo. She's from down under.
Oh, well, I'm glad you're enjoying it, Lola. Thank you for supporting this channel as well. It's awesome.
Thank you, Dr. Dean, for coming on. Awesome. Great show.
So I have to wonder, we're talking about the World War II era. We talk about the Cold War era. Right after that, we see the Star Wars program. Now, I'm talking about the movie, folks. You think that's kind of, because it seems like an escalation, and the Star Wars program almost being the peak of it. As far as taking a defensive stance, because we were all told that was for, missiles or whatever, but maybe not. What do you think?
Well, there certainly is. I've heard people suggest that the Star Wars project or the whole program was perhaps to defend us from something from out there rather than from the Soviets, which is an interesting theory. Perhaps I'm not sure what I think. I think it probably was just to defend us from the Soviets. That said, it is worth noting that President Ronald Reagan, who of course was the president who the Star Wars program was launched under, he said in a number of speeches, including I believe one at the United Nations, that imagine, I'll paraphrase because I can't remember the exact quote, but it's essentially, imagine if all of a sudden the world realized it was threatened by something from outer space or something from extraterrestrial. Maybe we would forget our national differences and we might all come together to face this external extraterrestrial threat. And he said that in at least 3 speeches, maybe more. So I do think whether Reagan actually just used that as an interesting allegory or whether he was genuinely concerned, you can bet your bottom dollar that people paying attention within the various agencies started wargaming these kind of ideas. Plus, it also ties into an awful lot of the science fiction, both of prior Reagan and post Reagan. So we talked about The Day the Earth Stood Still before. That's kind of the message of that film, right? Is that we shouldn't be fighting each other. We should stop the dangers of this type of nuclear, configuration or whatever, because the aliens might get annoyed and might come and stomp on us. Maybe this will unite us, this thing from out of space. There's an Outer Limits, which poses a very similar idea that the world might come together if there's the threat of an extraterrestrial invasion. In fact, Watchmen, the very famous comic book, which later became a movie adaptation, and the movie does it differently to the comic book, the ending, but in the movie, how Veidt, the kind of main, I guess, bad guy, superhero, of depending how you look at it, of the series, how he brings the world together is he stages a fake alien attack on New York City. This is before 9/11 as well. He stages a fake well, he does. It's not fake because it does destroy, I believe, New York City, but he makes it look like it's alien. And then that's his attempt to bring the world together, because he doesn't think that we should be struggling. He wants a kind of kumbaya world peace kind of thing. And Reagan's speeches implied something similar. So there seems to be very little doubt that both creative minds and political minds have thought about what would happen if we were threatened from outer space. So perhaps Star Wars does tie into that. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, do you think? Go ahead, Tex. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say and I know I sound like a broken record saying this, but God, it pertains to so much. When does all this stop being a coincidence? Anyway, go ahead, bro.
It's hard to know.
Yeah, it's hard to know, and it's like, when we're talking about these subjects, you either believe in aliens and other life on other planets and all things we're talking about, or you don't, or you're somewhere in between. I've heard many people just talking about how some suggest that our planet has been protected by other worldlies. They've actually stopped other alien invasions because they want our resources, or preserve mankind for whatever the reason is. And it goes back to like the Hollywood, right? That book, H.G. Wells, right? It's like, it makes me wonder if this really goes on. And it's such a hard thing for me to wrap my hands around, that all these incidents have happened. In 1994, we had the Michigan UFO phenomenon. You've probably heard about that, Dean. 360 UFOs are spotted out over Lake Michigan, caught on a blip on radar, but guess what? And they all disappeared right into Lake Michigan. 3,000 people called in. They saw it from Chicago to Detroit. To me, there's something going on, and you cannot tell me they're UAPs, right? Which I think the UFO, then you have UAP. To me, that's our equipment. That's what we make, that we don't identify as civilians. What's your take on that?
Gosh, that's it's difficult to can you just ask me the question one more? It sounds weird, but I was going in a different direction in my train of thought, and I'm like,
well, I'm just saying, it just seems, what the hell was I even saying? I know it's kind of too a long-winded question, because I got so much going through my mind with this. It's
Me too.
How are these things not real? We've had all these sightings in Michigan, 360 UFOs, 3,000 reports on the radar. They vanished in the Lake Michigan, just as one. Are alien otherworldlies really protecting us, or are they not? Or is that just a make-believe fantasy like H.G. Wells drummed up in that awesome book, and then later on in the movie? You know what I mean? It's just,
I do.
So hard to wrap your hand around.
No, there were about 10 different answers I wanted to give you. That's why I got a little but I think it's interesting you said they disappeared into the waters of Lake Michigan, because recently there's been a few different papers. Hal Puthoff, who is involved with to the Stars Academy, which was founded by Tom DeLonge, the once frontman of Blink-182, or one of the frontmen. I think they had two singers, and since the frontman of Angels and Airwaves, which is one of my favorite bands. But anyway, Hal Puthoff, who's a scientist, a PhD, I believe, attached to the Stars Academy, wrote a piece a couple of years ago about the ultraterrestrial hypothesis, which is something John Keel had talked about extensively. And ultraterrestrials has a number of different meanings, but in Puthoff's version of it, it was maybe there is another civilization or something else here on Earth. It might not be extraterrestrial. It might live beneath the waters, or live beneath the oceans, or live beneath the earth. Maybe it's closer to the type of things we heard about in fairy lore traditionally. that lived somehow here and interacted with us. More recently, only a month or two ago, a number of scholars, including a couple of people from Harvard, I think, wrote another piece. I wish I could remember the name of it. I only read it recently. Again, suggesting a similar thesis, tying into a book by the late Mac Tonnies called Cryptoterrestrials. I think they mentioned Tonnies. If they didn't, they should have. But Tonnies suggested something very similar, that maybe these things aren't from out there. So I'm not really answering your question, but I think it was significant that you said these things disappeared into the waters of Lake Michigan, because there's been a number of interesting papers, and including Mac Tonnies' book, which was a little older, suggesting that these things might come from here. Ivan Sanderson, who you guys might be more familiar with as the famous cryptozoologist. He was really one of the founders of the entire field. He did the work on the Michigan Iceman, for example. He was always on shows like, I think, Johnny Carson back in the day, one of the most publicly known cryptozoologists on the planet. He wrote a book, I guess it must have been late 60s or the 70s, called Invisible Residents, where he suggested these things lived beneath the waters of the earth and somehow came up. It's interesting that some of the Tic Tac videos and the Navy type videos and stories have these things going into the waters as well. There's many ongoing reports of these things going into the waters. Now, interestingly, the most recent paper I mentioned, written by the couple of people from Harvard, and I think maybe somebody from MIT, don't quote me on that, I might be wrong, but a few academics anyway. When they wrote their very recent paper, they brought Richard Shaver back into the mix, because Shaver and Palmer had initially suggested that these things were under the ground. And so when the sources first appeared in 1947 to Kenneth Arnold, Raymond Palmer had been publishing Richard Shaver's stories since 1945. So for over 2.5 years, he'd been talking about what was known as the Shaver mystery, that there were advanced spacefaring folks living beneath the ground, beneath our feet, really. And so there's been a long history, which we almost forgot within the history of modern flying saucers, where it's always extraterrestrial, that these things might be here. And older folkloric traditions, again, have suggested something similar. The best known is fairy faith from Ireland, where these things lived in forts or under hills or under the ground, and somehow maybe also slightly different. Maybe there was a thin veil, like a veil of reality, maybe interdimensional or something. But these things were here with us always. So I don't think that necessarily answered your question, but I do think that it tied into a point in your question, is that if these things are going under the water somewhere, or they're seen going into the sea or a Great Lake, maybe that suggests we're looking in the wrong places when we're looking, to the heavens or to the stars for where these things are coming from.
They say look up, and I get that, and I know that's kind of a tough question to answer, but it's just healthy discussion just to figure out answers, right? And where I live, Lake Superior, another one, reports of UFOs or lights coming out of the waters and disappearing into the waters. You even had First Nations people, Lake Superior, discussing it. It's even suggested there's underground military bases, or suggested alien bases in Lake Superior. It's just so, and we know that dumbs exist, right? Our government's got them all over. But to think that there's an actual alien dumb or something in the water, coast of Baja California, north of Mexico, aliens coming out, not aliens, UFOs, craft spotted coming out of the ocean. Think about the ocean. We look at the galaxy is infinite, but I know there's eventually a bottom in the ocean, but what do we really know? We can't get that deep. Mariana's Trench is the deepest, and it might even go past that with those caverns and caves they have. So I just don't know. I think they come from all over, and they could be in our waters.
Did you guys ever watch, was it The Low Files? Was that the name of the show? Rob Lowe's show with his son.
I never seen that.
It's the best paranormal show. Okay, the best paranormal show ever made is probably In Search Of, and then followed by Monster Quest from Doug Hychek. But the most fun paranormal show I've ever watched is The Low Files. In one episode of that, him and his sons go and investigate allegedly this off the coast of the West Coast. So I guess somewhere between LA and San Francisco. I know that's broad. I can't remember where though. That there were tunnels that came out from there up out through the ocean. But it's a fact. Yeah, if anybody hasn't ever watched the Low Files, I don't know what even streaming platform it's on. It's the most fun paranormal show I've ever seen. So just Rob Lowe and his sons going looking for Sasquatch and Bigfoot, and UFOs and ghosts and everything else.
Yeah, I'd like to get so would Tex. I'm sure get Rob Lowe on the show. Wouldn't that be something?
Oh,
I mean, a lot
of
these actors that do these, even Ozzy Osbourne's kid, that'd be interesting. But that's a dream, I guess. I don't have that many connections. But you mentioned something earlier, which was kind of a cool segue, which we'll get into. But before I do that, it's a midway point of the show. I'd like to thank you, Denise, for the super sticker. Texas Front Porch, thanks, buddy, for the membership gifting. Scott's Life, 6 months memberships, thank you. Scott's Life gifted 5, thank you, Scott. Thank you to Lola, 4 months membership. Girl and Her Gong, member, 8 months. So I love you guys. Thanks so much for that. Certainly the super chat and gifting is appreciated, not expected. So I'm humbled by all that every time that you make a donation. But you had mentioned about it was kind of a good segue. Then I got off on that dramatic long question that we really can't answer. Was about the shaver mystery, right? We talked about this maybe 6 months ago. I know there's a part 2. And this kind of all connects. This is kind of all related, is it not? And for those that maybe don't know about it, if you want to give a brief thought on that.
Sure. And I'm used to putting up the hearts from my beautiful girlfriend, Samantha. She was watching the show now and just did 3 hearts. And so I was like, I can't put your hearts up. Sorry, baby, but thank you for hearting. This is incredibly interconnected to the shaver mystery on so many levels. The first level, of course, I already mentioned. The first very surface level is that Fred Chrisman and Harold Dahl are the 2 main, I suppose, instigators or witnesses of the Maury Island incident, and that Fred Chrisman had already been in communication with Ray Palmer before he had sent him the slag from Maury Island, saying that I had fought the Darrows in the caves. And if you know what's best, drop this story right now. Apparently, as it is talked about, I think in The Coming of the Sources, when Ray Palmer, I think he heard Fred Chrisman's voice on the phone or somebody calling saying they knew stuff about what was going on in Maury Island. He recognized that voice as somebody he talked to multiple times around the country during the shaver mystery, who called him and warned him to leave the shaver mystery alone. So there's Fred Chrisman almost operating as a man in black, saying, this stuff is real, don't talk about it. So the Fred Chrisman connection with both the shaver mystery and Maury Island is a very, it ties those things in already. Of course, just quickly before we get back to what ties the shaver mystery in with UFOs and everything else, Fred Chrisman had also, or not yet, he was also later implicated in the JFK assassination when Garrison was doing his, as the DA of Louisiana or wherever the devil it was, when he was doing the Clay Shaw case and trying to prove this conspiracy, which of course the film JFK is based on, Oliver Stone's movie with Kevin Costner playing the DA. He later was subpoenaed by Garrison, and there was talk about Chrisman maybe being one of the 3 assassins at Dealey Plaza, because there's this photograph which shows 3 tramps which were apprehended at the time of the Kennedy assassination, and some people say one of them looks like Fred Chrisman. Now, I think to a degree that may have been debunked, but my point is that Chrisman is not implicated, he's definitely a major player in Maury Island, one of the major players maybe. Him and Dahl are the 2 major players. Was a slightly minor player in the shaver mystery, but was involved, and then later is called in for the JFK assassination investigation. That Chrisman has this, that he's interconnected with all of these major mysteries in history. And I have a good friend of mine, Brian Shickley, has done these incredible animations about Fred Chrisman and how he's involved with all of these things. And while I'm working on a documentary about Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver at the moment called The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers, and I have a shorter version just called The Shaver Mystery, just about the shaver mystery, playing at festivals at the moment. Brian Shickley is making a movie about Fred Chrisman, which is certainly very worthwhile, a documentary film, not like his animation. Anyway, so Fred Chrisman's a major link between the 2. But what happened when the sources were first seen, when Kenneth Arnold first saw the sources, according to Ray Palmer, is he got a phone call from Richard Shaver straight away, or a conversation. I assumed it was a phone call. They were very close to each other, so it might have been in person. And Shaver said to Ray Palmer, "This is proof. These vehicles I've been talking about for years, they do come out of the caves. They do exist. Kenneth Arnold has seen them." So something that Ray Palmer said after Arnold saw the sources is, for a long time in the Shaver mystery, they'd been talking about these vehicles which flew beneath the world in these long tunnels in the various caverns which connected the world, where the Darrow lived, supposedly, again, these weird deranged beings who caused havoc with the surface, as well as the Tarot, who were the good beings who helped us, who lived beneath the surface. But they had these devices which kind of moved through the caverns, and they flipped and they went this way and that way, and they moved in all these kind of weird ways. When Kenneth Arnold first saw the sources, he described them as flying the way that sources would if you skipped them across water. Like they were very, like, boop, 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 they kind of move up and down. And so that seemed to be proof to both Palmer and Shaver that the vehicles they'd been writing about in the Shaver mystery were real. The Shaver mystery talked not just about the Darrow and the Tarot, but there was an idea that in prehistory, in a pre-deluge period, there had been races on Earth that had fled the Earth because the poisons of the sun, the radioactivity of the sun, was causing so much aging and damage that they first went under the ground and built this incredible cavern complex. But then when the sun was still penetrating into the Earth, they fled into deep space. So there was an idea too that these things were coming back and sometimes would pillage the Earth. They'd still come back and they'd take people, they'd take things, they were involved with us, the people who had left, as well as the people under the caves. So Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver had already set up almost all of UFO belief, advanced technologies. These people had kind of psychic abilities. They could project voices into your mind with the technologies that they had. They abducted people. They could fly into outer space. And the Shaver mystery was an incredibly significant piece of Americana in that period of time. When Ray Palmer first began editing Amazing Stories, which the Shaver mystery stories ran in much earlier in the 30s, the magazine had almost folded. It had been bought by a publishing company called Ziff Davis, and they gave it to this young upstart, Ray Palmer, whose only background was sometimes writing stories for science fiction magazines and running his own sci-fi fanzine. He took this magazine from a circulation of 10, 20,000. It was almost going to go bankrupt, all the way up to 250,000 at the height of the Shaver mystery. So it was John Keel, who most of your listeners and viewers will probably be familiar with, being the author of the Mothman Prophecies, and he wrote a number of very other important books. But Keel identified Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver to a degree, as particularly Ray Palmer, as being the man who invented flying saucers, because he'd paved this idea of all of these things in the 2 or 3 year lead up to Kenneth Arnold's sighting. When you look at the covers of Amazing Stories, particularly often the back covers, there was all this art that imagined things that looked like flying saucers, literally drawings of flying saucers before Arnold saw them, drawings of ancient civilizations being visited by extraterrestrials. This is decades before Von Daniken. All of this stuff was in Amazing and on the covers of Amazing. So it's difficult, as Keel said, to imagine perhaps the development of UFO belief without the Shaver mystery having reached, well, again, it was up to 250,000 readers, or 250,000 circulation. I know, because I've taken advertising in magazines, and normally they will say, well, we sell 500,000 copies, so that really means 4 million people read them, because they say it's some are at the doctor's surgery, some are at library, some the father reads, the mother reads, then they give it to the neighbor. So there was conceivably, not to mention people seeing it on the newsstands, as Keel argued, there were probably millions of people exposed to the idea of the Shaver mystery at the time that Kenneth Arnold first saw the flying saucers. And just as an aside, and then I'll throw it back to you guys, when the saucers were first seen by Kenneth Arnold in June of 1947, the June 1947 issue of Amazing Stories that was already on the newsstands was the all Shaver mystery issue. Now, Amazing Stories was almost already the All Shaver mystery magazine anyway, because that was the major gimmick of the magazine, which had driven it to these heights. But in that issue that was already on the newsstands when Kenneth Arnold had his sighting, there was a piece by the great Fortean author Vincent Gaddis called Visitors from the Void. And Vincent didn't have the terminology flying saucers to apply to alien spacecraft from the beyond. That hadn't been a term that was popularized in regards to at least alien spacecraft until the sighting of Kenneth Arnold and then the way the press spun the sighting. But in the Visitors from the Void the piece in that All Shaver issue of Amazing Stories, Gaddis does this historical overview of essentially flying saucers, like things from other worlds visiting the Earth, almost like Charles Fort did even 2 decades, 3 decades beforehand, just listing all of these reports of people seeing weird things in the skies, potentially from outer space. And this was on the newsstands in Amazing the same month that Kenneth Arnold saw the saucers, the same month that this became a thing. So the Shaver mystery and Amazing Stories is, you can't even disconnect the two from the flying saucer belief that followed.
Wow. That's amazing. And, you know, such an incredible story. And Tex, I'm going to throw it over to you right quick because as I told you guys backstage, I got to let the pup out. He's staring me down. So I'll be back in about 90 seconds.
Sounds good. Well, you know what? Let's get into some of these questions that we've got when we got a few minutes. Caramundrum, have you ever heard of the metallic drop shaped craft? And I know we have. I saw one flying over my town called Lindsay, Ontario in 2014. It was really low. And they also go to say, I believe that the document that came out from Arrow, it made them the new Men in Black. What do you think about that?
We'll look at the Arrow thing. So there's a suggestion that Arrow may be the new Men in Black. Is that what's being implied in that question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Well, what interests me with Arrow and what interests me with all of the government approaches to, I don't know much about the earlier case, so that's why I'm not addressing that.
Right.
But as far as Arrow, what interests me with these government bodies that investigate flying saucers is there's often these conflicts with other government bodies. Like I think when David Grush came out, remember the guy who the whistleblower who coincidentally or not coincidentally co-authored the legislation that let him come out and do his claims about everything he knew, an X-Files type version of reality, is that I believe Arrow afterwards came out and said, or everything Grush has said about us isn't true. Like he didn't try to contact us. We don't know anything about him. And Lou Elizondo, who most people who are interested in flying saucers or UFOs will probably be aware of, his claims that he ran the Pentagon's ATIP program. Other people have come out and said there's no evidence that he ever ran ATIP. So our problem that we have with Arrow and ATIP and everything else is that there's always these conflicting messages from government insiders.
Right.
And the question then becomes is, do you not believe Grush? Do you not believe Elizondo? Or is all of this just very artfully woven that you can't get a hold of it? It's like this kind of eel in a barrel of oil. Like, how do you grab this thing when all these different components of the government are saying different things? So I think the listener's question is an interesting one. Again, I can't address the first part of it because I don't know anything about it. Is Arrow or ATIP part of, the new Men in Black thing? Maybe the way people thought Blue Book or Grudge before it, or any of these other Air Force agencies. But you know what? I don't think so. I think probably, I think whatever the Men in Black phenomenon is, I think it probably is multiple phenomenon. I don't know if any agency of the government which was identified as being that involved with the UFO question would come forward and do it anyway. I suspect if there is anything close to an X-Files type interpretation of the US government, or UFO reality was involved, I think it would be something very different. I think it would be something very different. I don't think it would be the one that was the front-facing government department dealing with these things.
You know, and that brings me up to something I've heard different things about, and I want to get your take on it. The Battle of Los Angeles.
Yeah, it's something I don't know a lot about. I'm aware of a photo from then that shows what looks like potentially a flying disc being bombarded with various ground to air artillery.
Right.
What actually happened there, I don't know. I know there are certainly skeptics who say it was just people being spooked essentially by war nerves. I don't know what happened as far as if it was based on an actual genuine interaction, or I know it's definitely a part of UFO mythology. Like, it's an important part of the story for sure.
Sorry about that. I got this little pup I'm watching, and I took my fence down, and he would run, and I would never catch him. So, but he listens to me, so that's all taken care of. I find it fascinating. We're talking about the Darrow. I heard from my recollection that weren't they like dwarf-like creatures, and their intent is like to eliminate certain races. Is that correct?
Well, there are certainly descriptions in some of the stories where the Darrow were dwarf-like creatures. There are also in other stories, though, where they're kind of large. So, I mean, there is examples of leaders of the Darrow being, these incredibly large and obese kind of creatures. The Darrow, which has become the pop culture way the Darrow described, is an illustration from the All Shaver Mystery special of Amazing Stories. I talked about the June 1947 issue, which later became a colorized cover of the Hidden World magazine when Ray Palmer reran all of these stories later when he moved to Amherst, Wisconsin, just down the road from me, where he colored the Darrow red. And the same image was on the cover of the first issue of the Hidden World. So people who often think of Darrow think of that famous illustration where, because there aren't that many drawings of them. There are some others, but for some reason this one became the one everybody paid attention to, with this kind of almost like Buddha-like being with this long elongated nose, which almost looks like an elephant trunk.
Right.
So that's the popular interpretation of the Darrow. But there are other, yes, I think in I Remember Lemuria, the original story about the original Shaver mystery story, which Ray Palmer adapted from a 10,000 word manuscript from Richard Shaver called A Warning to Future Mankind. He turned it into a 30,000 word science fiction, Buck Rogers kind of adventure type story novelette. So Palmer probably was responsible for writing that original description, where they're these kind of dwarfen, hideous little beings. But there are multiple descriptions of the Darrow, including ones we can't talk about on the show, even vaguely PG rated. There's a piece by Richard Shaver that wasn't published until after his death in I'm trying to remember what I have a copy of it over there. I wish I had it in front of me. It's something called like Richard Shaver and the Inner Earth, or Richard Shaver and the Inner Earth Mystery, or something, published by Tim Beckley, who we've now lost. He passed recently, about the Shaver mystery, and edited by Tim Schwartz, who's actually who's in the documentary and does the Paracast with who's the main guy on the Paracast? This is terrible. I can't remember his name because it's one of my favorite shows. Anyway, whatever. The point is that it's in that, and it was published long after Shaver and Palmer died. Palmer never published this, and that has a very adult descriptions of a Darrow in there. According to Shaver, his last Darrow abduction, when he'd moved from Amherst near me to Summit, Arkansas. So this was in the last decade of Shaver's life, and the Darrow are described a little bit different in there. So I think the Darrow are like us in a way, that you can get people who are short, people who are tall, people sometimes who are ridiculously larger, because sometimes they're hundreds or thousands of years old, and they've continued to grow, which the Shaver mythos talked about extensively. But they're never attractive. The Darrow are misshapen either by the sun's poisons for living here so long, or by the technology that was left behind by the beings who went to space. And supposedly, if you didn't take care of that technology, and this was everything from strange saucer type craft, which we've talked about, to machines where you could point rays at the surface to interfere with people's minds, to cause car crashes, to cause airplane crashes, to cause erotic feelings in people. But that machinery, if it wasn't taken care of, and the Darrow didn't know how to anymore because the people who invented it all essentially left, it would build up a type of, I guess, toxicity or irradiation, and it would malform their minds. And sometimes they themselves would spend so much time on the stim rays, as they were called, the erotic rays, that it would just deform them. So the Darrow were always very ugly, always hideous, sometimes dwarf and sometimes enormous and fat, but they were never somebody you would look at and go, oh, that's a handsome person.
Yeah. Well, basically, Darrow's an evil. It's an evil. What do you call it? Humanoid?
Absolutely. And it goes back to the original language that Shaver first introduced. That's how Ray Palmer found out about Richard Shaver. I think we talked about it a little bit last time, so I'll be very brief. Richard Shaver sent a letter to Amazing Stories in 1943, which I think wasn't published until maybe the January 1944 issue of Amazing Stories. And he claimed that he discovered this secret, or he was aware of this secret ancient alphabet, which was essentially the English alphabet, A to Z, but every letter had a meaning. So you could understand words by working out what every single letter meant, and then you would understand what the word meant. And the letter D meant detrimental or negative. So D meant so Darrow were detrimental, with the row was robots. And they weren't robots like we think of, I don't know, I am a robot, like this mechanical kind of being. It just meant robotic, just meant you had one way of looking at the world. So they were detrimental, and their one way of looking at the world was detrimental. They wanted to hurt people, eat people, cause damage, be malicious. So that's what the Darrow were. The tarot, the letter T, was like the Christian cross. It was a positive symbol. And so the tarot were integrative. They were helpful. So the tarot were these beings who had left behind, but they hadn't evolved like the Darrow, and they helped humankind. So it all tied in almost to that original letter that Richard Shaver wrote Ray Palmer towards the end of 1943.
So the tarot was, I guess, here to offset the Darrow. I mean, tarot, that was its enemy, and that was
absolutely,
I guess, the hero. Darrow, hero.
And they were fighting a losing battle, though, because there were more Darrow, according to Shaver. So the Tarot were trying to help us, but they were always fighting this losing battle. And according to Gray Barker, and I can't find this source anywhere else, I've asked the top Shaver scholar on the planet, Richard Toronto, who's a producer on the film, where did this come from originally? And nobody knows. But in Gray Barker's book, which we already talked about, they knew too much about flying saucers, which really cemented the idea of men in black, which I think was 1956. So I think Palmer and Arnold's book, we talked about the coming of the saucers, were like 1950 or 51. But 5 years after, Gray Barker, a very famous ufologist from West Virginia, cemented the idea of the men in black. In the book, they knew too much about flying saucers. But the first chapter, or the introductory chapter to that, gives one of the greatest overviews of the Shaver mystery I've ever read. Barker was switched on. And in that book, he says that Gray Barker says that Richard Shaver moved to Amherst, which is just down the road from me, which is why I'm making these documentaries. Richard Shaver moved to Amherst because there was a good tarot colony nearby. That's why he moved here, because he knew he could be protected by the tarot, because the Darrow always, according to Shaver, tormented him and bothered him and did all these horrible things to him.
I just want your opinion here. Talking about abductions, and we're not just talking about, alien abductions, extraterrestrial abductions, but now we're talking about the Darrow and everything abducting people. What? Let's talk about the Darrow real quick. What do they hope to accomplish? What are they trying to do? Because I mean, this one guy you're talking about has been abducted a few times by them. You know.
That's a good question. And let's put aside what the physical reality or not of the Darrow is for a moment to answer your question. The purpose of the Darrow, at least according to Richard Shaver, as I mentioned, was to make life difficult for us. But they also lived in an underground world where they needed people. They needed supplies. So often they would abduct people to eat them, but they would also abduct people to be their slaves. And they would also abduct people for horrible erotic purposes as well, which again, I can't talk about what that exactly is on a PG show. So that isn't that dissimilar to some of the stories we hear about gray extraterrestrials. And it isn't that dissimilar to some of the more recent David Paulides theories that the same things which are taking alien abductees that we hear about because they come back and they tell their story to, hypnotherapists or authors or whoever else. Sometimes these people don't come back. So there is a correlation to what we hear about today. Again, regardless of the reality, it's all within the same space. It also has correlations all the way back to fairy faith and before. So if we look back to Ireland's fairy faith, there are traditions of people being abducted who are returned to the real world, and there are traditions of people being abducted who never return to our world.
Texas got a missing time incident, which I know he doesn't really want to discuss, but oftentimes when we have missing time, do you think from your experience, from research and talking to other people you've had on your show, missing time, is that how come that always seems to be a link to an alien abduction?
Missing times, it's an interesting question. And again, there are fairy correlates or fairy law correlates, but often in fairy law, the missing time is very different. It can be that you think you're only in fairyland for a day and you come back and you found you were away for, 6 months or something, right? So there is that time question, which is interesting that it overlaps. I think a lot of the missing time problems, and I'm not counting Texas, is I think we might have anomalous experiences. People might have things that are very strange that happen to them, and that time goes off, and that we can't remember where we were. But I think the problem is that, and I've had I had some strange experiences when I was a child, which we probably don't have time to talk about now. But I think the problem is that when people go to hypnotherapists or researchers who have a dog in the extraterrestrial fight, like they believe aliens are coming here to, impregnate us or to build a hybrid race or whatever their theories are. I think the danger is if you have an anomalous experience, which might involve missing time, or you just might not be sure what happened, and if you go to somebody who already has a very laid out cosmology of how the human race is interconnected with these extraterrestrials, I think if you go into a hypnotic state with these people, there's a very real danger of a story being confabulated which fits the current mythology. And I'm not saying that as dismissing it as real or not real, but it's certainly a mythology because it's a strange belief system which we subscribe to, or some of us do. That you might have lost time that day you were driving on a highway and can't remember how you got from A to B, or that night when you were in your bed and you woke up feeling weird, or whatever, that you were taken by extraterrestrials. And so it is dangerous that so much of the narratives that have become the major part of UFO abduction law have been retrieved under hypnosis. And that, whether that's in the original Betty and Barney Hill abduction story. And incidentally, the psychiatrist who did that original, he didn't think they were really abducted. He thought this was something far stranger and weirder, but he never thought they'd been physically taken. Or whether you go through the books of Bud Hopkins or David Jacobs or John Mack or any of the prominent researchers in the field in the 80s through the 90s into the early 2000s, when this stuff was still really front and center in UFO lore. So many of these stories, which have become part of the traditional way of understanding what UFO abduction is, were retrieved under hypnosis. And of course, you're going into a state which is an imaginal kind of state. You're entering this different realm. You're being spoken to by a hypnotherapist who often isn't even necessarily, although sometimes they are, people who are genuine mental health professionals. And they always have a dog in the fight. When they're obviously, if they're writing a book about it, you know what I mean? Like any of these people, or Edith Fiore, who wrote Encounters, which was the first book I ever read about this, which had a profound impact on me at the day. They're all people who believe in extraterrestrial visitation. And then you're going into this state, conceivably already have seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or have seen an episode of In Search Of. It was back in the 70s, or since then having seen Fire in the Skies or The X-Files or Intruders, or fill in the blanks, because there's so many of these. Communion,
Right.
fill in. You're already aware of what an alien does. Even South Park, you're aware of what an alien abduction is meant to entail, right? So there's a danger, I think, in retrieving these memories. And so often lost time gets filled in by these I'm reluctant to say it, but it probably very well may be confabulated memories between an experiencer and a hypnotherapist. And that doesn't mean the experiencer hasn't had some kind of weird thing happen to them. It just means that it gets molded into fitting a very clear cultural trope. And one more thing, and I'll throw it back to you guys. Yeah. It's interesting when you look at the late John Mack's work, who was professor of psychiatry at Harvard University, who believed the abduction experience was a good thing, how most of his people he hypnotized, right, say, yeah, it was a good thing. It was, I learned all these things from it. But if you look at the people who thought it was a darker experience, David Jacobs, who was a PhD, the major historian in the UFO field, until he kind of went, I guess, native and started believing what the people he was studying was saying. He thought it was a negative thing, and colonization by the ETs was almost imminent. And Bud Hopkins, who everybody also, Bud Hopkins has passed now, just like John Mack has, who also thought it was a negative thing. It was always negative in Hopkins' book. So Hopkins and Jacobs were always negative, their patients for some reason, and John Mack's patients were always positive. So that alone tends to show that the therapist is having an interaction on these people when they go to him and say, I don't know what happened that night. I have a fuzzy memory of it. So that's the danger of missing time and trying to fill in that blank.
I also find it really quick, Tex, before I lose my train of thought, and want to ask this really quick. With this, I think that's kind of a dangerous. I know Tex has been, somebody's come forward and asked Tex about the regression hypnosis. Someone even asked me about if I'd be interested because of my experience that I had. And a couple things, and Tex agrees with this. I don't know that I want someone poking in my head, right? Especially when I'm asleep. And how do we even know? You see, that's such a thing you have to really research, because how do we know that what people are telling us when we come out of the hypnosis, that it's even true? They could tell you were on a alien spacecraft and you had all these things, weird things done to you, and they sent you back. Just like I've talked to several psychics, and I've done that regarding my encounter, and I've talked to 5 of them. I tell you what, I probably trust maybe one, because all 5 had all different theories or hypotheses that they came up with. So for me, fine and dandy if you want to get that done, but I just don't know that I would trust the person to get inside my head and tell me something that maybe I don't want to hear if it's true.
I think somebody who is a more objective therapist who works in the use of hypnosis to help with mental health issues or addiction issues or any of those kind of things will tell you that hypnosis is a dangerous state to try to retrieve memories in. I have Ed Schultz semi-regularly on Talking Weird, and Ed, among other things, is a trained hypnotherapist, and he's always said, yeah, it's very dangerous to try to retrieve memories. I remember when I was doing my PhD research for my dissertation on UFO belief, and I was in, I think it was a conference in Clearwater, Florida. I went to so many, but I think it was that one. I was speaking to somebody at some length about potential experiences or other things. They went and had a hypnosis session there, because you could, with Dolores Cannon, who's now passed. She was quite famous in the memory retrieval and New Age worlds. And he came back and he was telling me about the experience. And he was telling me how she was having him ask the aliens questions while they were abducting him. And I'm thinking, you had this experience, you know what I mean, like 20 years ago or something. How on earth are you able to have a narrative with them that a hypnotherapist today is enabling you to ask the questions that she wants you to ask them? So that again seems to suggest that this narrative's being confabulated and has a level of fantasy attached to it. Now, that said, I think people have genuine anomalous experiences. I'm sure Tex had a genuine missing time experience. Me as a kid, I had all kinds of weird experiences. But to go and to trust somebody who already has a belief system and knows how to use this, I guess, for lack of a better term, mental technology, hypnosis, and they have an agenda when they're delving into that and retrieving these memories or messages with you, it just seems to me to just beg to have problems thrown in there.
Well, not only that, and when you were talking, I'm like, it's not only can they lead you per se, their narrative or whatever, but you're bombarded with all this kind of stuff. And when this stuff happens to you, you're already looking at this kind of stuff. How long before it actually, that narrative that you're looking into and trying to figure out yourself, how long is it before that gets into your subconscious and becomes a part of that experience, whether you wanted it to or not? So that's the way you remember it, subconsciously and consciously.
Absolutely. I have a woman I interviewed at some length. I interviewed a number of people at length in my PhD dissertation, and she'd worked with Bud Hopkins, who arguably might be the most famous, next to John Mack and Whitley Strieber, alien abduction researcher, author who's ever existed. And she said that I'm sure she had experiences, because I talked to her. I genuinely believe she had something anomalous happen to her. And she said that he pushed and he pushed, and I just couldn't remember what these things looked like, what I was dealing with looked like. But he pushed and he pushed and he pushed, and eventually I told him exactly what I wanted. I knew he wanted me to hear. Mm-hmm. They were diminutive gray beings with, inverted teardrop eyes, which were black. So she, even as half aware when she was in that state, she just gave up what she wanted to hear. Now, you have to wonder how many of the stories, she was one of the people he literally interviewed. I think she even might have even made it into some of his books. You have to wonder how many of these people that are interviewed who helped build this alien abduction narrative, or any narrative, as so have been so inculcated or so imbued with the modern belief system of what these things are meant to look like, that they just repeat what they're expected to say. And maybe not everybody's even as conscious as the witness I was mentioning. Maybe not everybody's even that self-aware that they can be like, oh, I know what he wants me to say, but I don't really want to say it, but I will. Maybe most people just go with the flow. Right. And maybe it doesn't even take abduction. Maybe it doesn't even take hypnotic regression to get you to that state as an abductee. Maybe we have an expectation when we engage with something that we can't explain to paint it with our cultural preconceptions, and so we do. Something which we can't explain, maybe it's easier to explain within the construct of something which people will understand when we tell them the story.
Yeah, I mean the only reason, because when when we had, and there was two of us present when we had this time loss, and if I hadn't seen, and I question a lot of it, even though I've seen this film footage from the incident, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know where to put it. I don't think I don't want to be that guy. I really don't. I've had enough freaking experiences. I don't need an alien abduction on top of it.
Stay away from the hypnotist, then, would be my advice.
Well, I ain't letting nobody root around in my head when I ain't.
Yeah, Dean, they're really loving this show. They said you're one of the best guests I've had. So hats off to you. I wonder too if sometimes. Well, I've had a lot of weird, vivid dreams. We're not getting into that. I've spoken about it ad nauseum on several shows. You can find those on replay. But sometimes I get to the point where I'm thinking, and I'm not talking about myself though, but I think it gets to the point where some people just manifest a lot of things. I mean, they really dwell on something so hard that they either want it to be an experience or not. You can go either way, but they think about it, they dream about it. And let's say, and I think that could probably even develop false memories, right? I mean, you're actually putting a memory in your head that never existed, but you believe it so intently that it's a reality in your mind.
Yep.
It's interesting you should say that, because we were talking about Men in Black before, and we mentioned obviously that original modern experience regarding the Maury Island event and Harold Dahl, and we mentioned that Gray Barker had written the book which popularized it further, called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. The main case in the book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, is something involving an individual called Albert K. Bender. And Albert K. Bender ran one of the more popular, there were several of them, there probably even dozens of them, most of them probably have forgotten the history, flying saucer clubs of the late 40s throughout the 50s. And I think Gray Barker might even have been involved with that club, and they had a newsletter, and these were the days before the internet, so people had to mimeograph these newsletters and send them out. But Albert K. Bender said he was visited by 3 men in black. And the stories are very convoluted, and we could talk about it forever. But what's interesting about, and I think Barker mentions it and John Keel did later, is that maybe Keel even talked more about it, is that Bender was already immersed in a world of horror and demonology and super weirdness. So he had all kinds of monster art and weird creatures drawn all over his room, and he was very much immersed in scary, horrifying, demonic kind of things. So perhaps it's not that weird that if he had an experience with the numinous or the other or whatever we want to call it, that when it manifested, it was these scary men in black that came to threaten him. And so maybe when we front load ourselves with stuff, either intentionally or unintentionally, maybe today we're so immersed in it, when we see a light in the sky, we immediately think of it as a flying saucer. Or maybe if we have a missing time moment, it's easy to slide into a movie we've seen like Communion or Fire in the Sky, or there's hundreds of them. Or maybe it just sets a tone for us to be scared of these things. But it's interesting, again, that we can go back and attach early cases to clear preconceptions. Albert K. Bender is a classic example of the weird and the demonic. And then when you have this experience, it's, maybe it encourages the experience. That's something else John Keel said. John Keel said he would say to experiencers who were being haunted by, poltergeist activity or men in black or anything else, flying saucer sightings, he would say, just go and burn all of your stuff. Often these people were interested in it anyway. Get rid of all of your stuff. Don't think about it anymore, and it probably will leave you alone. So maybe it's a matter of when we focus on these things, like maybe Tex's experience is because he was focusing on the weird. Maybe not UFOs, but maybe because you were immersed in the field, that these things manifest more.
Yeah. We have a pretty knowledgeable, our chat groups on all our channels are very knowledgeable people, and Barry Kustachin, I hope that's how you say it, says a tulpa is a manifestation of someone's thought. That's even to a next level, right?
maybe to a degree, all of this stuff's a tulpa. I think a tulpa like Tibetan shaman or something would work towards building, you know what I mean? They'd want this entity that could go and do their will, right? But maybe, and think of a collective tulpa, by the way, as well. Think about when enough people believe in gray extraterrestrials abducting you in the middle of the night, what that might actually do, whether it's a real manifestation or whether it's just we're also plugged into this belief system, what when so many people believe in something, what that might actually do to our reality. It's a good question. It's a good point.
And Tex should check for implants per Brown Dwarf. Hey, Brown, good to see you back. You know, Tex, I know you're getting tired, man, and we're almost done over. We've gone over an hour and a half. Are there any questions that we missed that we can let you get some sleep here? It's been a fantastic show. I hate to end it. You know, Dr. Dean, I can have you on probably once a month.
Man, I love chatting with you guys.
You
it's
know,
so much fun.
You're so knowledgeable and I always learn something every day. I love doing these shows. I learn something on every show, and certainly learned a lot today. I don't know that we got any questions left. I seen a text start a couple, and then we can.
Yeah, we got one.
Okay.
Has any of you, Conundrum asked, has any of you seen a UFO? And if so, do you get daydreams after the sightings?
I can go briefly. I saw one about 7 years old. My mom got me and my brother out of our bed. She got up like a half hour before it was time for school. And as you know, as little kids, we like sleeping and we know exactly when we need to get up. So my mom said, Mom, we got a half hour, right? Just get your butts down here. Come on, I got to show you guys something. We come down, and sure enough, looking out of the kitchen window, there was again, I'll call it a flying saucer because it reminded me of one of my favorite television shows as a kid, Lost in Space. You guys, it looked just like that. It was maybe 150 to 200 feet hovering in the air. It was maybe 18-foot round, like an 18-foot round swimming pool, which, by the way, we had in my yard. So it was kind of like that. And then it just booms, darted, and it was gone. My mom calls my dad. He works at Chrysler at the time. And this is way back in the day. You're not supposed to call your husband at work in the factory, pull him off the floor because that's just a no-no, unless it's an emergency. She gets my dad on the phone, and she's telling my dad that she saw a flying saucer. You gotta be crazy for calling me for this stuff. I get in trouble. I'll call you when I get home. So that's how that kind of ended. And my brother and my mother and I saw this. But here's the crazy thing, you guys. And this is back, I remember way back in the day. And they didn't speak on the news about UFOs or anything like that, to my recollection, too often. Not at all. Even today, and if they do, it's a farce, right? They make fun of it. There were, in my neighborhood, within about a 10-mile radius, there was over like 200 phone calls into the news stations about some weird object floating around in my community. And that made the news. And my dad's like, you gotta be kidding me. You saw something or whatever it was. To this day, we don't know. But yeah, that's my UFO experience. And as far as having dreams about it, no.
I don't know. I saw some weird lights in the woods. You want to call them UFOs, you can.
Yeah.
I've never had daydreams or dreams about it.
I've never
even had a dream about the missing time thing. It really never bothered me. So I don't know. And I've seen other crap, but
yeah. Dr. Dean, ever see a UFO that you think might have been or don't know?
Regarding dreams, which is too long to go into now. I have very strange experiences, which may or may not have been bedroom visitations, or may not have been my young 4 or 5-year-old mind playing tricks on me regarding this kind of thing. That said, my UFO experience, my actual UFO experience, is kind of funny. I remember as a kid, one night looking out my window, and we were at the bottom of a very steep hill. Our driveway was very steep. It was kind of what's called in Australia a battle axe block. So it was the property at the bottom behind another property, and looking out at night. I think a friend was visiting, And there were all these crazy lights, like they looked like they were hovering at the top of my driveway. And I honestly, to goodness, I don't know how old I was. It was after the visitation period, I think, so maybe 6, 7, 8. Thinking I'd seen a flying saucer, because they thought there were UFOs out there. And maybe it was because, but maybe by then I'd seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where all the craft have lots of illuminated lights. Anyway, I think I worked it out when I talked to my mother the next day that it had just been the garbage truck coming and picking up our trash at the top of the hill. So it looked like this thing. Yeah, but no, I've never seen an actual flying saucer. No.
Well, there you have it. There we have it. I could continue to go on again with you, Doctor, Mr. Dean. Texas got to go to bed. This has been a fantastic show.
Yeah, always is with Doc.
Well, I love chatting to you guys. Thanks so much, Rob and Tex. It was a great time.
Yeah.
Always is.
And you had mentioned earlier today, because everybody, my second book, Bigfoot Mystery Represents True Cryptid Encounters, Book 2, is going to be out August 15th. If you've bought Book 1, thank you. Book 2 will be out in about 2 weeks. In fact, before we go, really briefly, I will. You guys all remember what the first book cover, of course, done by Jason McLean. He did, of course, the second book cover. It's very similar yet different.
This is a great artist.
That's Book 1. Blah blah blah. Okay, thank you. And this is the cover for Book 2. We reversed everything and went with a matte color, and it still pops. So
Nice.
yeah, it's pretty neat. So thank you, Jason, for that. That'll be out August 15th, and I'll send the links like I always do when it's ready to be published. We got to work on that this weekend. I think Jason and I are finishing it. So
We need to get you on Talking Weird to talk about that.
Yes, I know. I was on Talking Weird once or twice, I think. You know what? I'll have to make another visit. I like that show. You and Doug Untold Radio. I got to give him a plug. He's a good guy. He's been on my show, and Texas show. Doug Hijack. Cool dude. So before we go, Dr. Dean, why don't you tell everybody where we can find you, social media, all that, and then I will let starry-eyed Tex go to sleep.
Well, anybody who's interested in my work on the Shaver mystery and Ray Palmer and the invention of flying saucers, including my current short documentary called The Shaver Mystery, which is really extracted from the feature which I'm still working on and should be finished probably not for about a year, called The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers. If they go to theshavermystery.com, which anybody watching can see as my little signature below my name on the screen at the moment, that will take you to the Facebook page, which always has updates regarding the feature film and also has updates regarding where the short film is screening, because the Shaver Mystery 40-minute short is currently playing at a number of film festivals and other venues around the world. So theshavermystery.com. If they want to listen to me on Doug Hijack's Untold Radio Network, which is fantastic, I'm on every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Central, and they can either find that on YouTube or on Facebook or go to untolradioam.com.
Very good. I appreciate it. And really quickly, one more time, I got to thank Scott Slave, member, 6 months. Scott Slave gifting 5 memberships. Our new pirates. Lola, 4 months. Girl or Gong, 8 months. Cowboy, 4 months. Tex, thank you for your donation. Denise, for your donation. I appreciate all you guys. It's really awesome. And this was just a fantastic show. And of course, you're always going to have to be a part 2, I think. And so with that being said, I just got to find the extra. There's so much stuff in here now, you know. A couple of years doing this, I got to delete some stuff. Thank you, Tex, man. You're a trooper. Dr. Dean, you're a fabulous guest. Thanks to everybody in chat, listening later. With that being said, tonight, check out the Blondes and Booze with Tex. Oh, Tex, don't know how you're going to do it, but he's going to do it. 9 o'clock in the East, the Blondes and the Booze. Subscribe to all our channels if you're new here. Appreciate, love you all. Until next time, for Tex, for Dr. Dean, I'm BMR. We're out.